to the Straight to Video podcast with Rob Lane.
All right, and welcome to the first official episode of the Straight to Video podcast. I'm your host, Rob Lane, and first up, I want to say a big thank you to everyone that gave such positive feedback to the preview episode we launched last week. I was kind of going in a little blind and didn't know what the response would be, but I was really blown away by all the comments and good vibes to what I think is going to be a real long-term project and something that will be a great extension to everything that's already been done with Straight to Video. In a few minutes, you're going to hear my chat with guitarist, vocalist, producer, and all-round good dude, Steve Brown. Steve became well known for his time in the band Trixter, who were and still are one of my all-time favourite bands, particularly when I was first getting into music and finding my, let's say, identity back around the late 80s and early 90s. The guys in Trixter, they were just a couple of years older than me, so everything really clicked in that I loved the music and thought they were one of the coolest looking bands I'd ever seen. And stuff like that really has a big impression when you're 17 or 18 years old, as a lot of you will identify with. What's special about having Steve on this very first episode of the Straight to Video podcast, though, is that when I started Trash Pit magazine back in 2003, Steve was playing in a band called 40 Foot Ringo, yet another group that had a huge impact on me and also our band Teenage Casket Company. I really had no clue about networking or making contacts in the music business, but I emailed Steve through his website and asked if he'd be interested in doing an interview, and right away he got back to me and said sure. And that really did give me a lot of confidence to keep pushing and not be put off by approaching people and asking for help. So yeah, when I decided to get this podcast off the ground, Steve was one of the very first guys I messaged, and once again he came through, and I'll always be grateful for that support, as I am also for everyone who has agreed to help. During our talk, you'll hear Steve is he's like an encyclopedia of rock history. Just listen to how he reels off specific dates and years in this chat, and I really love some of the stories he shared. We touched briefly on a video clip that surfaced of him just in the past few weeks where he jumped on stage with Van Halen in the late 80s, which it's up on YouTube, so go hunt that down after hearing the backstory because it's a really fun one. Since his time in Trixter, Steve went on to form, who we mentioned earlier, 40 Foot Ringo and then Stereo Fallout. If you love just great melodic power pop, then please check both of them out. But Steve's also been in a band called Def Leppard. I think you might have heard of those guys. He's helped out by filling in for both Phil Collen and Vivian Campbell, so that alone is pretty impressive. That's how talented this dude is. As we speak, his new band Tokyo Motor Fist released their second album Lions actually today, which is July the 10th on Frontiers Records, and once again it's just great melodic feel-good rock and roll, so check them out on all the usual social media platforms, and hit up Steve at stevebrownrocks.com or on Instagram and Twitter. Again, that's at stevebrownrocks. I really hope you enjoy this chat, which is from Steve's studio over in New Jersey, and please, if you can, show your support for the Straight to Video podcast by subscribing or liking on your favorite podcast platform. And if you listen on iTunes, please consider dropping a quick rating or review, as that will really help spread the word. So here we go with my chat with Steve Brown of Trixter and Tokyo Motor Fist. With yourself, obviously music's been your main drive from a very young age, because you started what was the early foundation of what will become Trixter in your early teens, which is amazing. Was there ever any doubt that music was something you wanted to pursue?
Not at all, man. You know, it started in 1978 discovering KISS and VAN HALEN. It was a bolt of lightning that went through me, you know, a jolt of rock and roll, all the cliches that you've heard so many times. It's the truth. And, you know, when I was a kid, it was sports and music. And then as I got older and I just became more and more obsessed with guitar playing, you know, wanting Eddie Van Halen and Randy Rhoads. And I also became, I like to think, equally obsessed with songwriting and the craft. And, you know, I mean, it's something that I latched onto very, very early. And it was not by any teacher. I mean, I had guitar teachers, but the songwriting aspect was just something that clicked in me to where I knew that the key to all, as much as we loved KISS or Van Halen or Def Leppard or Bon Jovi or Motley Crue, the key to it all still is the music and the songs. The songs are the most important thing. Luckily, I latched onto that early instead of, and maybe that's to the detriment of my guitar because I can't do 8-finger tapping and 30-second note arpeggios, but I never really wanted to do that, know? So for me, it's just been that love of it all. And then when I started Trixter at 12 years old in 1983.
Crazy.
Yeah. Look, I grew up in the greatest time in the world. I think, born in 1970, growing up through the 70s, all those incredible bands, Led Zeppelin, KISS, Aerosmith, Van Halen, Cheap Trick, on and on. It never ends. And then the 80s is when, really when I discovered Def Leppard in 1980 was my first realization and like aha moment, light bulb went on when I read, I think it was in like Rock Scene magazine, that Rick Allen was 15 years old when they signed their deal and went out on tour. And I remember thinking, I'm like, because I think before that, I kind of thought there was like, well, you have to be 18 years old to get a record deal. Or you have to be 21 to go out on tour, or you have to be like the Partridge Family and your mom and dad have to go with you. So that was one of the moments. And, much like what your show is talking about, that was certainly a pivotal moment for me when I discovered Def Leppard. And how ironic is that, that I play with them now. And so, but that was, and actually when I spent a lot of time with Rick on the tour bus, I actually told him that story. And he's like, no, that's a great story, Steve. And, but it's the God's honest truth. So that was it. After discovering Def Leppard, I was like, I can do this. And you know what? I'm going to beat Rick Allen to the punch. I'm going to start my band at 12 years old. And, look, I didn't get signed till I was 18, but they were a huge influence. And, it was kind of the thing where it was like, all of a sudden I said, there is no age discrepancy in rock and roll. If you're good and you do something that is meaningful, people are going to take notice. And they certainly did.
That's awesome. So it probably added extra drive to it. Like you 12 years old, it's like, I can do this now. I got to pull my finger out and like get on with it. I got 3 years to beat Rick Allen on this thing. I got to get moving. So that's cool.
I think so. It was just, ultimately again, and it still continues to this day. It's in my DNA. It's in my heart and soul. I still love it, and like, me, dude, I still get the buzz from, I was showing you before, my new guitars, my new recording equipment, whatever new, on this new record was my first time ever recording with guitar plugins. Bruno Ravel turned me on to that. And I still get that same feeling, whether it's getting a new guitar, getting a new Eddie Van Halen amp sent to me, or writing new songs. It's still the same buzz I get as when I was a kid, and so that love of music and that love of all things rock and roll has never left me.
So Van Halen and KISS, what was your exposure to them? Was that through the radio? Was it magazine? You see a photograph in a magazine?
Here it is. It's one of the greatest. My oldest brother Mike and his girlfriend at the time, Marianne, who's now my sister-in-law, I've known pretty much since I was 7 years old. So it was 1978. I was over by her house, the other side of Paramus, New Jersey, where I grew up. And I looked in her brother's room and I saw his record collection. And there was an album cover sitting there, and it was literally calling my name. It was Rock and Roll Over by KISS.
Was it glowing?
It was, man. I could have sworn, I tell people all the time, I think there was smoke and fire coming out of it. It was like a KISS concert, but it was calling me, and I picked it up, and he walked in the room, and he like looked at me, and he said something like, I'll never forget it. He said, "That's pretty cool, isn't it?" He goes, "Steve, take that home. I think you'll enjoy it." I took it home. I put it on my little record player. I dropped the needle down. The beginning of I Want You starts going. I'm like, oh, this is nice. And like, kind of sounds like the Beatles and then all of a sudden, man, when the guitars kicked in and then Paul Stanley, I Want You. It like my head exploded. Everything. It was like every scene in a movie, when remember in Back to the Future when Marty McFly plugged in his amp in front of that huge speaker, hit the A chord and got blown away. That was it, man. That was the moment that just completely changed my life. And I listened to the rest of the record, Take Me, Calling Dr. Love. Dr. Love was one that, just completely hearing that and hearing Gene Simmons sing for the first time. And I still didn't even know who was who yet. And then later on, when I discovered that was Gene, the demon, singing Dr. Love, it was like, this is crazy. It was everything that, either you were going to be scared shit of KISS or you were going to love it. And then I fell completely head over heels in love with those guys. And then a couple months later, every kid in my town was a KISS fanatic. And I remember walking home from school one day and one of my neighbors goes, Steve, come here, you got to check this band out. I went into his house and he had an 8-track tape or the vinyl. I'm not quite sure what it was. It was an 8-track tape. And he put it on and played Running with the Devil. And I was like, he's like, you got to hear this band, Van Halen. And I heard it. I was like, oh my God. And he goes, you got to listen to this. And all of a sudden, boom, boom, eruption. And it was like, again, it was that moment where I was like, oh my God, this is the most incredible guitar. And then when it gets to the end, the tapping part, I still remember just being so confused because I didn't know if it was a guitar, if it was a keyboard, if it was a violin, if it was a video game. It sounded like otherworldly, which it still does to this day, and, listen, no matter what, guitar has come a long way, but that is, to me, Eruption is still the be all end all and the greatest guitar solo. And again, so those two moments, Rock and Roll over KISS and Van Halen won it. And it was, I say it all the time. I sold my soul to rock and roll at that moment, and I'm still running with the devil.
Van Halen 1's still one of the greatest vinyl sounding records, I think. Those couple of seconds between Eruption and You Really Got Me, where you hear the crackle, is just the sweetest. It's amazing.
I have my vinyl. I have it over there. And it's incredible. So that was it. And those moments shaped everything. And again, I don't think there's anybody, no matter what you do in life, whether you're an athlete, whether you're a businessman or something that you excel in, it's one of those things to where it kind of defines you, you don't need to really do anything. And as I always say, like, I sometimes still give guitar lessons and parents ask me advice. And I say to them, honestly, I said, if it's meant to be, if it's in their heart and soul, they will go with it. You can't force it. You can't really force anything, I don't think. The drive has to be there.
Yeah.
And that's the key of it all. And my daughter, a perfect example is my daughter. She's 20 years old now. She's a recruited Division I college track and field athlete. She does pole vaulting. She started gymnastics when she was 3 years old and excelled and loved it like I did guitar. It's in her DNA, I think, because of me. But it's one of those things to where we never had to force her to do anything. There were moments of, hey, man, look, when I had moments of despair with music where you just go, man, am I ever going to be able to make this happen? There were moments of that. I mean, I'm not going to lie to you and say it was just roses and every day was rainbows. It certainly wasn't. It was a lot of blood, sweat, and tears to get to that point. But again, it's never, to me, this never feels so much like work.
Yeah. There's always payoffs along the way.
Yeah.
Where did you used to buy your music from? Once you got that first KISS album or heard that first KISS album, where would you go and buy your records from in Paramus?
Yeah, well, it was more like major department store. Back in the day, there were two cool places, which I'm sure you might have even heard of these. One place called Corvettes, like, Corvette, but with a K, and Two Guys. They were like the Walmart and Target, if you will. And back then in the 70s, the record department, the music department was humongous. And it was just, for a kid like me going into that place, it was like, and there were KISS displays everywhere.
Wow.
It was just, the stuff that, there's things on YouTube that you can see of record stores from the 70s. It was it. And then there was in the malls that we had, because Paramus, where I grew up, was like the shopping mall capital of the East Coast, more shopping malls than any other town around. So with that, there were tons of record stores. There was Harmony Hut, which is an old school record store. Disco Mat, which came in like in the early 80s. And so I would ride my bike every other day to go to these places. And there was another store in the one mall by my house that was really influential. It was like a pseudo head shop, where they sold like pot paraphernalia, and they had all the rock posters you can imagine. They had those Mira posters, like KISS on a Mira painted. I still have one in my garage. It's so fucking cool. And they had the velvet blue light posters, and they had all the local rock photographers would sell their pictures there. Guys like Mark Weiss, Ron Akiyama, the East Coast photographers, like especially in the New York, New Jersey area, they would sell all their concert shots there. And I would buy all that stuff and it was a magical time. That's all I can say, man. It was just,
for sure.
Again, and those are the things that shape who I am and continue who I am, to this day, because again, being still the little kid who loves rock and roll, I still love to get rock memorabilia. If you can see around my studio, there's framed stuff everywhere, and it's what I love. It's certainly in my blood.
Before you started playing live, did you get the opportunity to go and see many live shows? Which was your first major concert?
First major concert was KISS, 1979, the Dynasty tour at Madison Square Garden.
Wow.
It was certainly...
That was the first concert. Everything's been downhill since then, surely.
Well, I wouldn't go that far, but it's been, to see KISS on the Dynasty tour. And it's funny now, knowing all the things that we all know as fans about how, let's say, unsuccessful the tour was. For me, and I, a lot of KISS fans, it was their first time seeing KISS. So to me, it was just magical. They were the biggest fucking superheroes, the loudest thing, and just incredible. And of course, being at Madison Square Garden, the most famous arena in the world, bar none. And then 3 years later, I got to see Van Halen on the Diver Down tour, which to me, that was the most important concert, because as much as I loved KISS, they were unreal to me, as they were to everybody else. To me, that was like, I'm never going to be in KISS. But when I saw Van Halen on that, and I think on the Diver Down tour in 1982, I think the original Van Halen, they were at their peak then. Because I think by 1984, they got too big, and the booze and the drugs and the ego were so out of control. And you could see that then. But in 1982, they still had that rawness. And it was just the first time of seeing that rock and roll with that party mentality, and people hugging and drinking and smoking pot. And I was just like, if I'm going to start a band, and I am going to start a band, I want it to be like Van Halen.
Yeah.
Because to me, Van Halen was a lot like KISS. They had the awesome production. They didn't have pyro, but their pyro was jumping around, their energy. David Lee Roth and Eddie Van Halen doing the scissor kicks. That was what I wanted to be. And to me, that was attainable. And that was when I formed Trixter. I said, to Pete, when I made him become the singer. I mean, he wasn't even a singer. It was like, he was the best looking guy in town. And I said, if I can get that guy to sing, we're going to have something. And that's what I did. It was a lot like what I think what Mick Mars and Nikki Sixx said when the first time they saw Vince Neil. They were like, we don't care what he sings like, but the way that guy moves and the way the girls go nuts, we're going to be okay. And so, but that was it. So KISS and Van Halen, that was the be all end all. And then throw in again, Cheap Trick was a huge influence. And Cheap Trick was the band that really, I think for me, Rick Nielsen and Robin Zander's voice, that was a big early songwriting influence. Because Cheap Trick to me, of course, I knew the greatness of the Beatles, but I, of course, didn't appreciate them. So Cheap Trick was like, they were like the Beatles, but it sounded like Aerosmith or KISS. It had the crunchy guitars, and it was like, that was something, the pop element, that what we like to call, 40-foot Ringo, hard pop, the atomic, melodic rock. That was, Cheap Trick was a huge influence in the songwriting thing. Again, I was so blessed to grow up in those times, because I think it's the greatest music ever made.
When did that clip come from? The Van Halen one where you jump on stage?
Oh, that's from 1988. That was on the OU812 tour, again at Madison Square Garden, and that was that's a funny story, because first off, I've been waiting for 32 years to get that footage, and So what had happened was, apparently years ago, the guy posted that video, but he didn't post the whole show. So I never thought that footage even existed. The long and short of the story is that our managers for Trixter, the one manager, this guy Joel, besides being our manager, he was a ticket scalper. Back in the day, he used to sell tickets for concerts. So as a gift to all of us and to me, like when we started working with them in 1988, he's like, hey, I got you guys front row tickets for Van Halen. So it was like, holy shit, this is the coolest thing in the world. Dude, I kid you not. It was we were sitting in the front row. My leg was on the railing like this, and Eddie's like 5 feet away from me. And again, my attitude has always been that, might as well jump. I'm going to give it a shot. And so to set it up better, Gus, our drummer, he jumped up on stage before me. Now you could see it in that video when they're doing Ain't Talking About Love. He jumped up before me and he went up to Alex's kit and he was banging on the cymbals. And it was the funniest thing in the world. We couldn't believe it because Alex is playing and cracking up and Gus is just standing there pounding on the cymbals. Eddie's guitar tech, Zeke Clark, who I'm friends with now, comes and grabs Gus, doesn't rough him up, pulls him off. And next thing I know, like 5 minutes later, Gus is back out in the front row with all of us. So that got me going. I'm like, well, I'm not going to get my ass kicked. So I'm going to fucking jump up on stage with Van Halen. And sure enough, I waited and they did Rock and Roll after Ain't Talking About Love. And it was the end and they were ringing it out. And I'm just waiting. And my buddy Jim, who passed away last year, God rest his soul, he kind of pushed me right at the right moment. And you could see it. I went right up to Eddie and I go, most people don't know what I said. I go, dude, let me play your guitar. And Ed, as you can see, he just lifts up his hands. I get behind him and I just start doing this, the famous, lick that Eddie always does, the thing. And what was cool about it, which I never knew, as you could see in the video, Sammy is watching me and you could tell that he's listening. You could hear it. He could tell that I could play. And so Michael comes over and I was honestly hoping Ed would take the guitar off and like let me rip.
Don't push your luck.
Yeah, exactly. Well, you know me, man. I'm just like, man, let me in the band. Get out of here, Ed. I can finish the show for you. But again, they were so cool. And then Zeke came out again and grabbed me. And, everybody asked, did they beat you up? I'm like, no, man. They were like laughing. And then at the end of it, the coolest thing is Sammy goes, that's a bad mofo right there, he says. And what's really neat about that is afterwards, my buddy Jim, God rest his soul again, he kept saying that. He was more blown away that Sammy actually noticed. And I never saw that because I was in the moment. So that was really cool to have that video when I did the Izzy Presley show. It was just like, I couldn't fucking believe it. Me and PJ were like, it took 32 years to finally get that footage.
That's amazing, man. So cool.
Yeah.
How did you find new bands back in the day? Was it through magazines or just word of mouth through your friends and stuff like that?
Yeah, I mean, it was all of that. Back then it was, you'd walk to school and all of a sudden you'd see see a girl with a jean jacket with a Bon Jovi shirt. That was the first time I think I remember hearing about Bon Jovi. I saw some girl either wearing a shirt. And I was like, man, who the hell is Bon Jovi? And then that was like a day later, I saw the Runaway video and that was it. But back in the early days, it was all the magazines, Cream Magazine, Rock Scene, Circus, 16 Magazine. That was my thing. And the other cool thing is when I started taking guitar lessons in mid 78, right next door to the music store, Musically Yours was the name of the place in Maywood, New Jersey. It was the next town over from Paramus. And it was like a little downtown. And right next to the guitar shop was a magazine shop. You would go in there and back then KISS was on every magazine. And it was like, I would go in and my head would be spinning and I'd go to my mother. I'd pick up like 10 magazines. Mom, I need all of these. And she goes, you can only get one. And I'd pick out, the one that had KISS in it the most. And I still, it's great, dude, in my garage, I still have a lot of those magazines from back in the day. And they're still in great condition. So, back then they used to make magazines better than they do now.
They still have copies of the Trixter Color Spectacular.
Of course, man.
It's a classic.
That was it. I mean, that was pretty much, again, that Metal Edge magazine that if Trixter was around in the 70s, we would have one of those magazines. It would be 16 magazine or Teen Beat. 16 Magazine and Teen Beat were like the fanzine. Those were kind of, Jerry Miller made Metal Edge kind of like the 16 Magazine Teen Beat of hard rock. That's kind of what she did with that because she worked there. So she knew that angle. And
she saw a formula in a way. She can take it and put it into this kind of thing. It worked, man. It's friggin' Metal Edge was my Bible back then.
I still have magazines now, and I look at them and it's like it was just a magical time. That whole, I'm going to just say for me, from 1978 to 1992, that was kind of, in 93, honestly, those were just fucking, it was the best, and sadly it got quickly wiped out, but so be it.
Everything's got a time frame and just, you got to ride it and appreciate it. It was friggin' great, man. When you became performing regularly, were there many outlets in New Jersey for, let's say, to earn your stripes? Because you were still young, and obviously you weren't 21 to drink and stuff. Was it like all ages places, or did you actually do your own gigs in school halls? I'm just guessing.
Yeah, well, that's where we started out. Our first 2 gigs were with Trixter was, we weren't even Trixter yet. The first gig that we ever did, we were called Raid, RADE. It's kind of like a take on the Rock Brigade. And I was like, the Rock Brigade Raid, and I was like, I don't know what it was. It was a typical rock and roll weird thing like Def Leppard, Led Zeppelin. Spell the name wrong, spell it different, make it look cooler.
Put a K or a Z in there somewhere.
Yeah, exactly. And then, and then I was like, well, I came up with a cooler name, Trixter. And put the X in it, to make it more heavy metal. And so our first 2 gigs, our first gig was in February 1984. We played at my middle school where my dad was the vice principal, Eastbrook Middle School. And, that was incredible. That was the first time, being on stage and discovering the power of, girls at rock and roll shows and how crazy they can get. The sound of, the buzz you got from the crowd, and that was all I needed. And then the next gig we did was at our town in Paramus, our town outdoor band shell. The summer, it was July of 1984, and that was the first official Trixter show, which I posted some photos of that, and that was it. And then we did some high school stuff, roller rinks after that. And then in 1986 is when Bon Jovi started taking off. And that was really when the scene in northern New Jersey and everywhere for that matter, is when everything started going haywire.
That must have been insane when they kind of exploded in just your area. I mean, it exploded around the world.
It was because what was cool about it was we recorded our first demo tape in February of 1986. And here's the tape machines are right over here that we record. I'm transferring all the analog stuff now. But we recorded that. And when we made the tape, right before Slippery When Wet came out in September of 1986, Pete and Gus got to go and they gave John a press kit while I was at school. And John called us and left a message that he listened to the tape and he thought we had a lot of potential. And that was really impressionable for us and really important, and, forever grateful to John for doing that, because it gave us like the validation that, yeah, we're good, man. This means something. And of course, the success of Bon Jovi, we were like, shit, if they can do it, we're going to do it. And a couple months later, we met John backstage when they played the Meadowlands Arena New Year's Eve with Cinderella. And we were there with John, and John goes, hey man, Steve, I want to introduce you to somebody. And he introduced me to Dave Sabo from Skid Row. And that was the beginning of a friendship between the 3 bands that would last to this day. We're all still friends, and, but Jon Bon Jovi was really the guy who kind of linked us all together. And then the success of Skid Row, we had the same lawyer, and we were all, and Dave and Rachel and Scotty, they were so helpful to me and helping with Trixter. And, it's just one of those things, the difference between the New Jersey bands and the LA bands. The LA bands were all dog eat dog. Those guys would never help each other. It was kind of like kill or be killed. The New Jersey thing, which was, Jon Bon Jovi kind of coined the phrase, the brotherhood. It was very much like that. we all took care of each other. There's a great producer, songwriter in New Jersey, guy Jack Ponte, who was a big inspiration to me and a big help to Trixter as well. And he was, a guy who co-wrote some of the early Bon Jovi stuff, Shot Through the Heart. Again, this guy helped us out so much, and we would do the same. We had younger bands who we would have open for us. It was very much a unified scene. We all were there. So we started playing these two clubs. There was one in northern New Jersey called the China Club, and it was an all ages Sunday night. And that's really where we cut our teeth and really became the Trixter that we became later on, that the world knows now, because that's where we kind of put all the pieces together and put our band together in the sense of our live show.
Yeah.
And playing and getting used to what works and finding out what gear works, because it was all new to us. And we didn't have, let's say, I do it with young bands to where, they hire me or to produce them and to be a mentor. And I tell them, no, you need this amp, you need to do this. When you play a gig, you need to bring somebody to carry your amp and plug in your stuff because you're going to be busy. We didn't have any of that. So every gig was a learning experience and a building experience. And that's what we did. And we would play. There was the China Club, and there was another place called Studio One, which is a famous place that kind of was where Skid Row got signed. We played the first show that Sebastian Bach ever did with Skid Row in America. I mean, we go back so far with the Skids. We played gigs when they had Matt Fallon in the band. And so it was just an incredible time. And again, all these different kinds of bands. We would play with some heavy bands. There was this great band, SS Steel, which had Maz, who would be later in 40 Foot Ringo and throwing rocks with us. Maz was like he was like the Glenn Tipton, Angus Young, James Hetfield. They were like a heavy band. And then we would play with this other great band on the bill, Pharaoh, who was like KISS meets Duran Duran meets the New York Dolls. So you had these three bands, completely different, but it all worked. And that was the beauty of the scene, that you would have all these groups of people. And it was, hey, man, it was no secret. Trixter back then, we had the best looking girls at our shows. So you'd have all these dudes, these biker hardcore Metallica fans, Motorhead, they would be at our shows. They didn't probably like us too much, but they liked the scenery, I'll tell you that.
Being here in the UK, I was wondering how you perceive New York City as a youngster, with it being a neighbor state to New Jersey and stuff. So how did such an iconic place so close to you feature in your upbringing? Was it somewhere that seemed far away, somewhere dangerous or anything like that?
Not
or was
really.
it somewhere you did visit regularly with your family?
I did, because I lived, Paramus is only, like 13 miles outside of New York City. My dad and my brother went to Columbia University in New York. So since I was a little kid, I was always going to New York City. I saw KISS, Madison Square Garden, my first show in 1979. So New York was never anything that it was a threat. I loved it. I loved New York. And when we started playing there, probably in 88, 87, when we started playing, it was great playing. We played the Limelight. We played the Cat Club, all these legendary places that we could get in. And it was, I don't know, man, it was like, I was 17, 16, PJ was 14. We were playing Lemoore in Brooklyn. As long as you weren't drinking, you were okay. As long as you were just playing, I think we had to sign some sort of waiver, or even I know one or two times we had to have PJ's mother sign something saying that he was going to be working. But it was just a magical time. And again, these eclectic shows that we would do, to where, Trixter, and there was this great band from Staten Island called Law and Order, who were on MCA Records. They were sort of like the Cult, they were kind of like, had a little Guns N' Roses thing. Again, you would never think that the bill would work. This band all bikered out and all leather. And we got along great with all these bands. It's like, again, the brotherhood thing that we had, the East Coast thing, I think really played into it. And me, and that is just the environment that I thrived in, because I don't judge anybody, and I want everybody to be successful. So for me, it was like, the more bands that get signed to become, we become friends with, the better off it's going to be. And luckily we were one of those bands in 1989 that got signed.
One thing I've mentioned online before, but I don't think I've had the chance to mention it to you, the Human Era video, which you guys did for Trixter, that had a massive impact on me. It really, well, you spoke about it earlier, just that time period. It really cemented what I consider my go-to time, the turn of the 80s into the 90s. I was just finishing school, going into college, and music was becoming my main focus back then.
Yeah, PJ, you gotta give PJ Farley. You know, he did that all on his own.
Yeah.
It was kind of a surprise to us. And that footage, the me and him driving in my car. The day I got my license, I think I loaded up my car in 1987. I loaded up my car with my guitar and my amps and drove to a gig.
Yeah.
You know, and it was like, that was it. That was my mom and dad's house where we rehearsed. Again, those times, man. For bands nowadays, you know, I don't know if that exists, and I feel bad, you know, because nowadays it's like what we're doing, you know, it's all video stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, the kids nowadays, their grasp on technology, it's different. And we, you know, the important point of Human Era was being that in 2015, we were entrenched in technology and, you know, your phone and, you know, this and that. The idea was, and there's a lyric, you know, to where if you have a problem, you deal with it face to face, as opposed to sending an email. Or because as we know, and especially in this crazy divided country that I live in right now, in the world that we're living, it's so easy for people to be, you know, so big and brave, texting and writing emails and stuff. But when it comes to face-to-face stuff, how many people really speak the truth?
Yeah.
Because it's easy to hide behind this. So that was our whole thing, because that's when we grew up. You weren't able, when we had a problem with the band, with personalities or with music, we dealt with it face to face. If somebody wasn't measuring up, whether it was me or Gus or Pete or PJ, we fucking would take care of it right there. You know, and it was harsh sometimes, man. I could be, you know, again, and, you know, still to this day, I make no bones about it. I work my ass off to be at a level. And for certain things, when it comes to music and making records or whatnot, I can be a big asshole. And I freely admit that. But it's for the reason that all I want to try, I try to go for greatness. And I don't care what it takes to get there. And, you know, I know in the past, I've certainly hurt a lot of people's feelings and walked over people to get to where I need to be. But, you know, it was for one goal, and that's, you know, to make my dreams come true.
Have you seen the Last Dance, the Chicago Bulls Michael Jordan documentary?
Oh, of course.
He says a similar thing, doesn't he, where they say it was almost like he was bullying people and like really getting down on people. And he says, well, if they don't want to be at my level, get gone, because I want the best. I want to succeed in this to be as good as it is. So you're either up there with me and I'll bring you up to that level, or you can just get gone. So it's a similar kind of philosophy, really, I suppose.
Without, I mean, of course, you know, I mean, Michael Jordan's one of my idols, one of my heroes. You know, I was lucky enough to see him play. I was lucky enough to see him play in those 98 playoffs against New Jersey Nets. I was like blown away. But yeah, I mean, that was totally, if you ask PJ or Pete and Gus about the way it was with me and guys that worked, it wasn't pretty. But it was never, you know, it was never to be mean. It was just
never personal.
It was to win, you know, and it was the way I was raised. You know, I grew up, my dad was a semi-pro baseball player. He pitched against the 57 Yankees. My oldest brother, Mike, was an all-century baseball and football player. In the Brown DNA is winning. We want to win at all costs. And that's the way I looked at rock and roll in a sense. You know, as much as it's art and stuff like that, we all know that it's not called the music business by accident. It's called the music business because it is, and it is brutal and it is rough, and you have to be tough to succeed. And I luckily learned that at a very early age. And again, you know, getting back, Jon Bon Jovi and the Skid Row guys, they were a huge influence on the business end of that, where you have to, and John was the guy who, you know, told me, you know, especially after when Trixter had success, we saw John the night our record went gold. We were playing Irvine Meadows Amphitheater, and he was in our dressing room and just so happy for us. And him and I had a conversation on the side because he knew I was the, you know, go-to guy. I was the songwriter, and he gave me some words of advice. You know, he just said, Steve, keep your eye on the ball. You know, and there are definitely some things that I wish I had done differently back then. But, you know, again, getting back to, the thanks to Jon for those little pieces of advice that I still use to this day.
It stuck with you all this time. It wasn't just some flippant advice. He nailed it.
Yeah, man.
I'm going to let you go. I really appreciate this.
All right, brother. Well, it's great to see you again. And, we'll do it and keep writing and let me know anything I could do to ever help you. I'm always there for you.
All right, man. Speak to you soon, Steve. Thank you ever so much.
Cheers, baby. Love you.
There you go, Steve Brown of Trixter and Tokyo Motor Fist. Well, thanks, Steve, for all the cool stories. He also spoke about a bunch of future Trixter material in the form of remastered demos and also video footage he has from the band's second album, Here, which still today is one of the best rock records you can find. But in the meantime, check out the new Tokyo Motor Fist album, Lions, which is out now on Frontiers Records. I want to say a big thank you for listening and supporting the Straight to Video podcast. Anything you want to ask or any suggestions and ideas, totally welcomed. I want to aim to get a new episode out each week, and if time allows, possibly a midweek episode too. So be sure to like, subscribe, and follow wherever you listen. I'll catch you guys next time. Thanks for tuning in.